Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the Infinite Dial webinar today. I'm Jo Dick, and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Commercial Radio Australia. This is the sixth year this study has been commissioned, and today we're excited to share with you the latest trends in Australia's audio landscape. A copy of the presentation will be available post the webinar. Now I'm going to hand over to Larry from Edison Research to share the results with you. Thanks again, and please enjoy.
Thank you, Jo, and welcome everybody to the Infinite Dial Australia for 2022. I'm Larry Rosin, President of Edison Research, and I'm so excited to have this chance to yet again present the results of this important study. Unfortunately, doing it virtually from here in New Jersey. I hope that next year I'll be down there with all of you in Australia presenting in person, but one more time we'll do it this way on Zoom. And as it is Zoom, you'll see at the bottom of the screen there's both a Q&A box and a chat box. Feel free to use both. If you have questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A box. We have people monitoring the box and making sure that they're there to answer any questions that you have. In the chat box, feel free to discuss the results. Tell us where you're coming in from to watch this presentation, and have a discussion about what's going on. It's important for me to thank our sponsors, Triton Digital, listener from SCA, and most especially our major sponsor, CRA, Commercial Radio Australia. We thank them so much for their generosity and helping to bring this research to all of you today. So with that said, let's get going, and here's the Infinite Dial Australia for 2022. I'll start with a little outline of the presentation. I'll walk through how the study works and the methodology. I'll talk a little bit about online audio in the aggregate, radio then, and both live and on demand, and the updates on that. What's happening in the car to audio and other media in the car. The very hot topic of podcasting will come after that. I'll look at smart speakers, some online audio streaming services, the pure plays, if you will, and finally I'll end with some observations. So starting with the study and how it worked. If you've seen it before, you know, but we welcome you if it's the first time. The Infinite Dial Australia is a study that's trying to explore the penetration of online digital audio in Australia, as well as other platforms and technologies that Australians are using. It's alongside of the Infinite Dial from the USA, which is the longest running survey of this kind. It goes back, believe it or not, to 1998. This is the sixth Infinite Dial Australia report, so we've been doing it annually now since 2017. So we'll see lots of trending data looking at how things have changed over time. And one of the cool things is we can compare the data from Australia to the US, and we'll have some particularly interesting points on that as we go through the information today. How did we do this study? Well, in the first quarter of 2022, we did a national telephone survey of 1,001 Australians aged 10 and older. But in order to compare the data to the US Infinite Dial, the data I'm going to show today shows those 12 and over, and we weight the data to reflect the national population figures in Australia, 12 and older. So let's start by looking at online audio. This is a graph that aggregates the answers to a variety of questions about using online audio and shows the percentage of all Australians who say they've used any form of online audio in the last month. And so we now have 6 years of data, as you can see there, our most current estimate on the far right. And you see we have a nice increase again year on year. We're now up to 78% of all Australians saying that they've used some form of online audio in the last year. And you see that steady growth rate year on year as this technology becomes more pervasive in Australia. We also do the same measurement for weekly online audio listening, and here you see the current estimate is 71%. So you'll remember on the previous page it was 78% for the last month, it's 71% for the last week, which means that if anyone's doing it at all, they're very likely to be doing it regularly, and so they have listened in the last week, 71% of all Australians, and as you can see, significant rise year on year up to this percentage point. On top of which, we asked anyone who said that they have listened to online audio in the last week to estimate how much time they've spent. And as you can see on the far right in orange, we had a big jump year on year. And Australians estimated that they spent 13 and a half hours on average in the last week listening to online audio. So this is really significant. Not only are we showing more people saying that they've listened to online audio, but that larger group says that they are listening more. So you can sort of multiply those numbers together and see that the aggregate amount of online audio usage has really grown steadily and is now up by far to the highest level we have seen. Meanwhile, we've been tracking data about radio. And as you will see, that even as new options have grown for Australians, their feelings about radio haven't changed hardly at all. So we track have you listened to radio in the last week, whether live or on demand. And you can see that our estimate for 2022 is exactly the same as we saw in 2021, 80%. So this is a really huge number. And I will mention that it's a much higher number than we see in the other infinite dial studies we do around the world. So we have lots of evidence that Australians, while adopting new options for audio consumption, continue to really like radio. And as a visitor to Australia many times and someone who will listen online to your radio content, one can hear that it remains a really vibrant media with great talent, great investment. And so as Australians take on new things, they also stick with their radio habits. If someone told us that they listen to the content of radio online, we ask them what device they use to listen. We see some changes year on year, not dramatic ones, but the radio station's app has now taken over as the biggest source of online listening to radio. Half of all online radio listeners now saying they listen on the app. That's now a bit ahead of the radio station's website. We had essentially the same estimate for an aggregator app or website, and smart speaker, which we'll talk about in a lengthy way later, up a point. So now 24% of all online radio listeners saying that they listen on a smart speaker. So next, let's turn to in-car media and look at what people are listening to in their cars. First, we've been tracking every year, as you can see here, whether people tell us they have an in-dash system that receives information or entertainment over the internet. Sometimes these are baked in, sometimes people are using things like Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, and you can see the number is growing year by year and now up to 31% of all Australians telling us that they have one of these systems, with a nice size jump year on year. With regard to what people listen to in their car, here we're asking anyone who's 18 or older and has driven or ridden a car in the last month, which is 84% of all Australians, what they listen to. And you can see by far the leader is radio, whether AM, FM, or DAB+. 80% of all Australians who are in cars saying that they listen to the radio, more than twice the next highest number, 39% for people listening to online audio streaming services such as Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Music. Then down the list from there, people's own music collection, 34%. CD player still used by 34% of Australians. That often surprises people, but most people have CD players in their car, so of course they're going to use them. Podcasting at 32% of Australians now saying that they use podcasts in their car. And the streams of AM FM stations, 16% of Australians saying that they use that source. How did those numbers compare to our American study? Well, they track astonishingly equally. As you can see in every case, the number is almost exactly the same or exactly the same as our American estimate. The biggest difference is 2-point difference for podcasts, where the Australian number is a couple points higher. But this is a fascinating graph, how similar these estimates are in terms of using these different sources of audio in the car. The one difference is in the United States, we have satellite radio, known as Sirius XM. 22% of Americans say they use that. And of course, you do not have a product like that. But it's just a fascinating graph how similar these two estimates are. So now let's turn to what is surely the hottest topic in the world of audio these days, and that's podcasting. First, let's look at awareness of the term podcasting. And you can see that number. Last year I said it was about as high as it could go, and you see it's essentially the same this year. 90% of all Australians saying that they're aware of the term podcasting. A number I'll note is much higher than the American estimate. And here's probably the most anticipated graph in this study each year. We again see a rise in monthly podcast listening. We're now up to 40% of all Australians saying that they've listened to a podcast in the last month, up from 37% last year, and a big rise from 2 years ago when it was 25%. So we had Australian podcast listening on a monthly basis lagging American data for many years, but as you'll see on this next page, that is no longer the case. The light blue bars on the left of each of these pairs is the US estimate for each of the last 6 years, and the green bar on the right is the Australian estimate. And you'll see that your data from Australia was tracking behind the American data each year, getting closer last year. And here in America, we actually saw a dip in monthly podcast listening from 41% down to 38%. Meanwhile, yours went the other way, growing from 37% to 40%, as you'll see on the far right-hand side of this graph. And as a result, for the first time, the percentage of Australians who say they've listened to a podcast in the last month now exceeds the American estimate by a couple percentage points, as you see there. That hasn't fully translated into a gain in weekly podcast listening, as you can see on this graph. We got the exact same estimate year on year. Still a very healthy number, 26%, but that's the same estimate that we saw last year. So it'll be interesting next year to see if the gains in monthly listening over time pull up this number a little bit more for weekly podcast listening. And you will also see that that 26% on the far right is exactly the same as our estimate in the United States. So for years, I was coming down to Australia and presenting this data and showing that your podcasting industry was lagging American data. And now we can certainly say that these numbers are in line with each other. Where do people tell us they listen to podcasts? Well, this is among that group of monthly podcast listeners, anyone who says they've listened to a podcast in the last month, 83, and of course they could answer yes to any or all of these. 83% say they listen at home, 60% say they listen in a car or a truck, 50% walking around, 29% on public transport, 27% at work. And obviously you would think that it relates to the kind of work someone does. Some kinds of work you would think would be very hard to listen to a podcast, other kinds of work very helpful to listen to a podcast perhaps. And even 19% of podcast listeners say they listen at the gym or while working out. And we've been tracking every year, as you can see here, how people listen to podcasts. What are they listening on? Still, far and away, the majority of people say that they most often listen on a smartphone, tablet, or other portable device. We do see that the percentage has gotten smaller since we started tracking this for people listening on a computer. But a few years ago, or now 4 years ago, we asked about that in-car entertainment system that I mentioned earlier in the in-car section of the study. And that's now up to 13% as the most used source, most used device, if you will, for listening to podcasts. So that's really one to watch, where people have clearly adopted it in their cars and are using their car system as the primary place that they're listening to podcasts. We also asked podcast listeners, anyone who said they've listened in the last month, how many podcasts they subscribe to. This number's been relatively steady over time. It took a little dip from 10 to 7 and went up to 8 podcasts subscribed to on average this year. And remember, the base of monthly podcast listeners rose. So it's more people saying that they subscribe to more podcasts. So you see that the story is very robust and very exciting in terms of what's happening in podcasting in Australia. On top of which we asked how many episodes of podcasts have you listened to in the last week, and the average here is 7. And you see in green on this pie chart, 15% saying 11 or more. So we have a nice sized chunk of Australians who are very, very heavy podcast listeners. And this mirrors what we see in the United States and in other countries. For many people, once they get into podcasting, they get very into it and often listen to many, many podcasts. And as we did with overall online audio, we asked podcast listeners to estimate how much time they spent in the last week listening to podcasts. And you can see after 5 years of very, very flat numbers, very similar year on year, we see a big annual rise here of over 2 hours on average. So if you've listened in the last week, while the percentage of people saying they listened in the last week was the same, the amount of time they report listening is significantly larger. After podcasting, the other hot topic in the world of audio is smart speakers, and we've been tracking this data for a number of years, so let's look at this year's results. Here's the percentage of Australians who say they own any smart speaker, and we see it rose again from 26% last year to 28% of all Australians now owning any smart speaker. This is a number that, while it continues to lag the American number, you have closed the gap over time, and then they each went up 2 points year on year. So the American estimate went from 33 to 35, your estimate from 26 to 28. So the same gap as last year, but you see the gap used to be much larger. These numbers sort of tracking along with each other, and recall that the US had smart speakers available before Australia did. What kind of smart speaker do people have? Well, this is the percent of the total population saying they own any brand. We basically have the same estimate for Google Nest, by far the leader in the space, with 23% of Australians saying they own a Google Nest. 5%, a little gain year on year for Amazon Alexa, now up to 5% of all Australians. And we had a 1-point increase for the Apple HomePod, now up to 2% of Australians saying they own an Apple device. If someone told us they have a smart speaker in their household, we asked how many of these smart speakers they have. And you now see that just under half of all Australians who have at least one now have two. And in fact, the average number is 2. So we see that 51% of smart speaker owners said 1, and 49% said 2 or more, and a quarter said 3 or more. So we see the same pattern in the United States and in other countries where we do this study. For a lot of people, once they get one, that makes them want to get a second. They have one in the kitchen, let's put one in the family room, or let's put one in the bedroom, etc. So you're showing a very similar pattern to what we see in the United States, and as smart speakers become available in more rooms in the house, of course, naturally you would think they're being used more. How does that compare to the United States? Again, it lags a little bit. Here in the States, a majority of smart speaker owners say they own 2 or more, and the average is a little higher, but as you can see, you're sort of closing the gap here as well. In the last year, we did a study with Commercial Radio Australia called the Smart Audio Report. And I'm going to take a little detour here to show some results from that study, just because they're interesting and relevant to this discussion of smart speakers, and we want to make sure people remember some of these key findings. So we asked any smart speaker owner whether they are listening to audio more since they got their smart speaker. And very similar percentages in our US Smart Audio Report as compared to the Australian Smart Audio Report, but very big numbers. 59% of all Australian smart speaker owners say they are listening to more audio since they got their smart speaker. So that's the exciting thing about smart speakers. It reminds people to listen to more audio, it encourages them to listen to more audio. We also asked smart speaker owners what do they use their smart speaker for. Here were the top answers, and you can see at the top, listening to audio, whether it's radio, podcast, streaming, etc., was the top usage of smart speakers, followed by getting information, things that help like utilities, and on down the list. So audio is the number one use case for using a smart speaker. Moving on, let's turn to online audio streaming services, where we ask about a variety of brands and their usage. So here is awareness of 5 major audio streaming brands, and we don't see a lot of change year on year. Most all Australians are familiar with Spotify, as we've seen for the last several years, 90%. 83% are familiar with Apple Music, 80% for YouTube Music, the streaming music service from YouTube, 58% with Amazon Music, a little drop year on year, and SoundCloud at 46%, again, a little drop year on year for awareness there. If people use services that have both free and paid subscription options, we asked about both. As you can see there for Spotify, if people use Spotify, about 2/3 of Australian Spotify users say that they pay for a subscription, and about 1/3 say they only use the free service. That's very different from the results we see here for YouTube Music or SoundCloud, where more people are using the free service by quite a large margin. And what are people listening to weekly? Well, the results again, very similar year on year. Spotify now up to 45% of Australians saying that they've used that service or listened to it in the last week. The results for the other services really flat year on year. Spotify, by a significant margin, the most used service. How does that compare to the US? Well, the competition is a little bit different in the US with regard to streaming. So Spotify has a much higher number in Australia as compared to the American estimate. We have other competitors, Pandora being a big one, not reflected on this graph, which sort of changed the competitive situation a bit. YouTube Music used more in the US, as are Apple Music, and in particular Amazon Music is a much bigger player here in the US as compared to Australia. So that's the data. Now let's turn to main observations and what we found. The things I hope you'll take away. Digital audio options, as you saw, continue to grow across the board, and now nearly 4 in 5 Australians aged 12 and over are using online audio monthly. So we're tracking a very dynamic field with a lot of growth and a lot of usage. Despite the growth in sort of native digital audio options such as pure play streamers and podcasts, radio listening showed no year-on-year diminishment, and Australian radio measures exceed what we see in other countries around the world. It's very noticeable to someone involved in the audio space how even as digital things are growing, your radio sector has so much investment, so much talent, so much excitement that it really seems to hold its own very, very successfully in the face of new competition. Podcasting continues to grow, monthly listening now up to 40% of Australians 12 and over, and that estimate now exceeds what we see in the United States. So for many years, I would show in these reports that your numbers in podcasting lagged, and you actually surpassed us in our estimate this year with 40% of all Australians listening to podcasting. And finally, smart speakers continue to make their mark in Australian homes, now nearly 30% of Australians owning at least one device, and as you heard me say, many of them now owning 2 or even more devices. And so there you have it. That's the Infinite Dial Australia for 2022. Thank you so much for watching. If you're watching live, we will keep both the Q&A box and chat boxes open for a little while so you can continue to ask your questions or chat. If you're watching on a recording of this video, you can feel free to send questions to info@edisonresearch.com and we'll get back to you straight away. The deck is now posted both at the Edison Research website and the CRA website, so that's available to you immediately. I want to make sure I thank our sponsors yet again, Triton Digital, Listener from SCA, and most especially our major sponsor, CRA Commercial Radio Australia. And I want to add a little personal note. Many things brought Infinite Dial to Australia, but it never would have happened without the great leadership of Joan Warner, or as you know her, Joan Wana. And I know that Joan recently retired. I'm sure she's watching. And I just want to thank Joan for all the leadership and support that she showed over the years and wish her a fantastic retirement. So that's all from here in New Jersey. Again, thank you for watching and have a great day.